My stepmother wants to control my life. She went nuts when I had her do it. When my dad married Diane 5 years ago, I was already 23 and living on my own, so I figured her impact on my life would be minimal. She seemed normal at the wedding, talking about how she respected boundaries and understood I was a grown adult who didn't need another parent. My dad was happy, I was happy for him, and Diane seemed like she'd be a decent addition to holiday dinners. For about 6 months, she really was fine. We'd have lunch sometimes, she'd ask about my job at the accounting firm, and she never overstepped. I actually started thinking I'd lucked out in the step-parent department. Then I started dating Tom, and everything changed overnight. Diane suddenly had opinions about everything. Tom's job at the fire department wasn't stable enough. My apartment was too far from their house. My work hours were too long to maintain a healthy relationship. She'd call me 3 times a week with articles about relationship psychology and career planning. When I mentioned I was thinking about adopting a cat, she sent me 20 links about why pets destroy young people's financial futures. My dad would just shrug and say Diane cared about me and wanted to help. The real escalation started when Tom and I moved in together. Diane lost her mind. She called an emergency family meeting where she presented an actual PowerPoint about cohabitation statistics and failure rates. She'd made charts about my spending habits that she somehow knew about, probably from grilling my dad. She even had a timeline of where my life should be by 30, and living with a boyfriend wasn't on it. When I said thanks, but Tom and I were happy with our decision, she told my dad I was being reckless and needed intervention. That's when the daily check-in started. Every morning at 7, Diane would text asking about my plans for the day. If I didn't respond within an hour, she'd call my dad saying she was worried. She started showing up at my apartment randomly to make sure I was keeping it clean enough. She'd criticize everything from my grocery choices to my laundry schedule. Tom started calling her the warden. She tried to get me to switch jobs to a company her friend owned where she could keep tabs on me better. When I refused, she actually called my boss to discuss my career trajectory. My boss had to ask me to handle my personal situation because it was getting weird. Then came the pregnancy scare incident. I made the mistake of mentioning to my dad that I'd had a late period and Tom and I had been nervous. Within hours, Diane was at my door with pregnancy tests, prenatal vitamins, and a binder about family planning. When I told her it was just stress and everything was fine, she said I needed to be more responsible and maybe she should manage my birth control schedule. That was it. I was done being her project. But I couldn't just cut her off without causing drama with my dad, so I decided to maliciously comply with everything she wanted. Diane wanted daily check-ins? She got them. Every single detail of my day, texted in real time. Woke up at 6:47, brushed teeth for 2 minutes. Used Tom's toothpaste because mine ran out. Had 17 minutes of shower time. Used lavender shampoo. Made coffee with 2 sugars. By day 3, she was begging me to stop, but I said I thought she wanted to be involved in my daily planning. She wanted to manage my finances? Perfect. I sent her every single receipt. Coffee for $3.47. Parking meter for $1.50. Pack of gum for $2.19. I asked her opinion on every purchase. Should I get the name brand tissues or generic? Is $40 too much for a work shirt? I called her 6 times during one grocery trip. She stopped answering after the 4th call about which yogurt brand had the best probiotics. When she said I should consider her friend's job offer, I went all in. I scheduled the interview, then called Diane hourly with updates. What should I wear? How should I do my hair? Should I mention my college internship? I sent her photos of 14 different outfit options. During the interview, I excused myself to call Diane and ask what to say about salary expectations. Her friend later told her I seemed unstable. The masterpiece was when she suggested Tom and I should see a relationship counselor she knew. We booked it immediately. Then we asked Diane to come to every session since she knew our relationship better than anyone. We'd call her during sessions to ask her opinion on what we were discussing. The counselor said having a third party that involved was unhealthy. We said Diane insisted on being part of all major decisions. The counselor actually called Diane and told her she was creating codependency issues. Everything came to a head when Diane planned a surprise life coaching session for my birthday. I walked into the restaurant expecting a normal birthday dinner with my dad and Tom. Instead, I found a full conference room set up with a projector screen, printed handouts at each seat, and a woman in a blazer standing next to Diane. The woman had one of those forced professional smiles that didn't reach her eyes. Diane waved me over with way too much energy. She introduced the woman as Courtney Medina, a life coach she'd hired to help me reach my full potential. The table had glossy folders with my name printed on them. Inside were career timelines, relationship milestone charts, and financial planning worksheets. Tom squeezed my hand under the table. Dad looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. I realized this was Diane's biggest power move yet, turning my birthday into an intervention about my life choices. She'd invited 3 of their couple friends who sat looking confused about why they were there. Courtney started her presentation about goal setting and life optimization. She asked me about my 5-year plan. I decided right then to play along completely. I launched into a detailed breakdown of my morning routine, explaining that I wake up between 6:40 and 6:50, depending on how many times I hit snooze. I described my entire skincare routine, the exact order I put on my work clothes, and how I organize my breakfast preparation. Courtney looked a bit confused but kept taking notes. I moved on to my relationship with Tom, explaining how we split household chores and our system for deciding what to watch on TV. I went into detail about our grocery shopping strategy and how we handled disagreements about thermostat settings. Diane's smile started looking strained. I described my current work projects in accounting, including the filing system I use and my method for organizing spreadsheets. I explained my lunch break routine and how I prioritize my afternoon tasks. Courtney stopped writing and just stared at me. I kept going, talking about my evening routine, my weekend plans, and my thoughts on various household appliances. Tom was trying not to laugh. I answered every single question Courtney asked with way more information than anyone wanted. She asked about my career goals, and I spent 10 minutes describing the different certification programs I'd researched. She asked about my relationship timeline, and I explained our system for planning date nights. Diane kept trying to redirect the conversation, but I just kept talking. After 20 minutes, Courtney stood up and pulled Diane aside near the kitchen entrance. I could hear her saying this seemed more like a family control situation than a coaching opportunity. She said I appeared to have my life together, and she wasn't sure why she was there. Diane's face turned red, and she started talking quickly in a low voice. Dad finally spoke up and asked Diane why she thought surprising me with a life coach on my birthday was appropriate. The couple friends were looking at their phones and clearly wanted to leave. One of them made an excuse about a babysitter and practically ran out. The whole dinner collapsed into awkward silence. Courtney packed up her materials and left without finishing her meal. Diane sat there with her arms crossed while Dad paid the check. Tom and I left without eating our entrees. 2 days later, Dad called while I was at work. He sounded tired. He said he'd been thinking about the birthday disaster and realized he'd been avoiding the real problem because dealing with Diane's reactions exhausted him. He admitted watching her hire a life coach for my birthday made him understand how far things had gone. He promised to support me if I wanted to set boundaries. I asked if he really meant it, and he said yes. He sounded sincere but also nervous about what that would mean for his marriage. I thanked him and said I needed to think about what boundaries would actually look like. He said to take my time and call him when I was ready to talk about it. The next afternoon, Diane showed up at my apartment door with a huge gift basket. It had fancy chocolates, bath products, and a card with a long handwritten message. She had clearly rehearsed a speech about respecting my independence and understanding that I was an adult. She said all the right words, but her tone was off. Before I could respond, she suggested we schedule regular check-ins so she wouldn't worry about me. She pulled out her phone calendar and started proposing times. I realized this wasn't a real apology. This was damage control. She wanted to look like she was backing off while still maintaining control through scheduled contact. I told her I needed space to think, and she looked hurt, but agreed. She left the gift basket and walked back to her car. That evening, Tom came home from his shift at the fire station and found a manila folder in our mailbox. He brought it inside looking confused. The folder had my name written on the front in Diane's handwriting. Inside were printed screenshots of my social media posts from the past 6 months. She had my work schedule that I'd never shared with her. There were notes about my daily patterns, what time I usually got home, which grocery store I went to, and when Tom worked night shifts. She'd been tracking me like I was some kind of project that needed constant monitoring. I felt sick looking through all the pages. She'd been building a case to prove I needed her guidance. Tom was angry. He said this crossed a major line and we needed to do something about it. I agreed but didn't know what would actually work. Tom suggested we write everything down. He said we should make a list of specific boundaries with clear consequences and present it to both Dad and Diane together. We spent that evening at our kitchen table creating a document. We listed acceptable contact frequency, which was once a week maximum unless there was an emergency. We banned certain topics, including my career choices, my relationship decisions, and my daily schedule. We wrote that unannounced visits were not allowed, and she needed to call first. We included that contacting my workplace was completely off limits. We specified that if she broke these boundaries, we would reduce contact for a set period of time. Tom helped me make it clear and direct without being mean. We saved it and emailed it to Dad so he could read it before we met. 3 days later, we met Dad and Diane at a coffee shop downtown. I brought 2 printed copies of our boundary document. Tom sat next to me and Dad sat across from us. Diane arrived 10 minutes late and looked defensive before we even started talking. I handed her the paper and explained that these were the boundaries we needed going forward. She read through it and her face went through several expressions. First confusion, then anger, then something that looked like she was trying to appear reasonable. She said some of these seemed harsh. Dad told her they seemed fair to him. She looked at him like he'd betrayed her. Tom pointed out specific examples of why each boundary existed. Diane's jaw got tight, but she nodded and said she'd try. Dad said he supported these boundaries and would help enforce them. We finished our coffee in uncomfortable silence and left separately. 3 days after our boundary meeting, my phone buzzed at 6 in the morning. Diane had texted asking if I'd thought any more about the job opportunity her friend had mentioned last month. I stared at my phone in disbelief. We'd just had the boundary conversation and career advice was specifically on the banned topics list. I took a screenshot of the text and sent it to Dad with a message reminding him that this was exactly what we'd talked about. He responded an hour later saying he'd talked to her. I could tell he was frustrated. That afternoon, I called Dad and told him that according to our agreement, I was reducing contact with Diane for 2 weeks. He sounded disappointed. He asked if that was really necessary, and I reminded him that we'd set clear consequences for a reason. He was quiet for a moment and then said he understood. He accepted it, but I could hear the strain in his voice. I felt guilty even though I knew I was doing the right thing. This was the consequence we'd all agreed to, and Diane had broken the rules within 3 days. I hung up feeling both relieved that I'd enforced the boundary and terrible that it was causing Dad stress. Tom told me I'd done exactly what I needed to do and that the guilt would pass. The next day, Dad called around noon. I saw his name on my phone screen and almost didn't answer. I picked up and heard the strain in his voice before he even said hello. He sounded tired. He said Diane was really upset about the 2-week contact break, and it was making things difficult at home. She kept asking him to intervene. She wanted him to convince me to just call her, so they could smooth everything over. I sat on my couch and felt that familiar pressure building in my chest. Part of me wanted to give in just to make Dad's life easier. But I'd spent years doing that and it never actually helped anything. I told Dad that supporting my boundaries meant accepting temporary discomfort. I reminded him that we'd all agreed to these consequences together, and backing down now would just teach Diane that she could ignore the rules. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said he understood and he'd support the boundary enforcement, but I could hear how much effort it took for him to say that. His voice had that exhausted quality that made me feel guilty even though I was doing the right thing. We hung up and I sat there staring at my phone feeling like the worst daughter in the world. 3 days later, I got a message from my cousin Rachel. She said Diane had been calling extended family members all week. Diane was telling everyone she was worried about my mental health and asking them to talk some sense into me. Rachel wanted to give me a heads up that the family grapevine was buzzing. Within an hour of that message, my uncle called. Then my aunt from Dad's side. Then my second cousin, who I barely talk to anymore. All 3 conversations followed the same pattern. They'd heard I was going through something difficult. They wanted to make sure I was okay. They suggested maybe I was being too hard on Diane, who just wanted to help. I tried explaining the boundary situation, but I could tell they'd already formed their opinions based on whatever Diane had told them. By the time the 3rd call ended, I felt completely isolated. Everyone was looking at me like I was the problem. Diane had managed to turn herself into the concerned stepmother and me into the troubled stepdaughter who needed intervention. I was so angry I wanted to throw my phone across the room. That evening, my Aunt Hannah called. I almost didn't answer because I was so tired of defending myself to family members. But something made me pick up. Hannah's voice was different from the other calls. She didn't start with concern or suggestions. She asked if Diane was trying to manage my life. I said yes and braced myself for another lecture. Instead, Hannah told me that Diane had done the exact same thing to her 10 years ago. This was before I really knew the extended family well, back when Dad and Diane had just started dating. Hannah said Diane had tried to control everything about her life, how she raised her kids, what job she should take, who she should be friends with. Hannah said she'd had to completely cut contact for an entire year before Diane finally backed off and left her alone. I felt something shift in my chest. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. Someone else had experienced this exact same thing and survived it. Hannah kept talking. She told me Diane has always needed to manage the people around her. It comes from deep insecurity that got worse after her first marriage ended badly. Her ex-husband had an affair and left her suddenly, and ever since then Diane had been trying to control everything she could reach. Hannah said it wasn't really about me at all. Diane would have done this to anyone who came into Dad's life and gave her access. Understanding the psychology behind it didn't excuse Diane's behavior. But it helped me see that this wasn't personal. I wasn't being targeted because I was doing something wrong. Diane would have acted this way no matter what choices I made. The problem was inside her, not inside me. We talked for almost an hour, and by the end I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Thanksgiving was 3 weeks away. I had to decide whether to attend the family dinner. Diane would definitely be there. Extended family would be watching to see how we interacted after all the drama. Tom and I talked about it over dinner one night. He said we should go but have a clear exit plan. We agreed that if Diane violated any boundaries, we'd leave immediately without making a scene. I called Dad the next day and told him our conditions. We'd come to Thanksgiving, but we needed him to tell Diane in advance that the boundaries still applied. No career advice, no relationship suggestions, no comments about my life choices. If she couldn't manage that, we wouldn't stay. Dad promised he'd talk to her. He said he wanted us there and he'd make sure Diane understood the rules. The morning of Thanksgiving, I woke up with my stomach in knots. Tom made me breakfast, but I could barely eat. We got dressed and drove to Dad and Diane's house. The whole drive, I kept rehearsing in my head what I'd say if Diane started in on me. We pulled up and I saw cars already filling the driveway. My hands were shaking when I rang the doorbell. Dad answered and hugged me tight. He whispered that everything would be fine. We walked in and I saw Diane in the kitchen arranging food on platters. She looked up and gave me this overly bright smile. She said hello in this formal, polite voice that sounded nothing like her usual tone. Tom stayed next to me the whole time. We helped set the table and made small talk with relatives. Diane was performing for everyone. She asked me gentle, appropriate questions about work. She complimented the dish I'd brought. She was clearly showing the family that she was being reasonable and respectful. I responded naturally without getting pulled into whatever drama she was trying to create. Dinner itself was surprisingly normal. People ate and talked and laughed. Diane stayed in her polite mode the entire time. After dinner, people moved to the living room for coffee and dessert. Diane found me in the hallway and asked if we could talk privately. My whole body tensed up, but I agreed. We went into Dad's office and closed the door. Diane stood by the window and didn't look at me for a few seconds. Then she turned and said she knew she'd overstepped. She said she'd scared me away, and she understood why I'd set boundaries. Her apology wasn't perfect. She included some justifications about how she'd only been trying to help. But I could tell she was genuinely trying to understand what had gone wrong. She said she didn't want to lose her relationship with me. I told her the boundaries had to stay, but I appreciated her acknowledging the problem. We didn't hug or have some big emotional moment, but something had shifted slightly. Before Tom and I left, Dad pulled me aside near the front door. Other people were saying goodbye in the background. Dad told me he'd been setting his own boundaries with Diane about her need to control everything. He said he'd started seeing a therapist a few weeks ago, and it was helping him speak up more. He apologized for taking so long to support me properly. He said watching the whole situation unfold had made him realize he'd been enabling Diane's behavior for years. I hugged him and told him I was proud of him for getting help. We left feeling cautiously hopeful that things might actually start to change. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, Diane sent me a text. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I stared at the message for a while before responding. We agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop on Saturday morning. I got there first and sat at a corner table. Diane arrived 5 minutes later. She ordered her drink and sat down across from me. The first few minutes were awkward. We both commented on the weather and the coffee. Then I started talking about a project at work. Diane actually listened. She didn't interrupt with suggestions or advice. She just nodded and asked follow-up questions. It was weird. About 20 minutes in, she started to slip into suggestion mode. She began a sentence about how, then she stopped herself mid-sentence. She apologized and said she was still learning. It happened one more time before we finished our coffee, but both times she caught herself and backed off. The whole thing was uncomfortable and awkward, but it felt like actual progress. Tom and I established a new routine with my family over the next few weeks. We agreed to monthly dinners at neutral locations like restaurants. We set clear time limits so the visits didn't drag on. We picked places where we could leave easily if things got uncomfortable. Diane still occasionally texted unwanted advice. She'd send me articles about career planning or relationship tips. But when I reminded her about the boundaries, she'd apologize and stop. Dad started backing me up when I enforced the rules. He'd text Diane privately and tell her to respect the limits we'd set. It wasn't perfect. Diane still struggled with her need to manage things. But she was trying, and Dad was finally supporting the boundary enforcement instead of asking me to just let it go. I started noticing changes at work about 2 weeks after establishing the new routine with my family. My manager assigned me to lead a client presentation, and I actually volunteered for it instead of trying to pass it to someone else. During the meeting, when the client pushed back on our timeline, I held my ground and explained why rushing would hurt the quality. The old me would have just agreed to whatever they wanted to avoid conflict. After the meeting, my manager pulled me aside and said she'd noticed I seemed more confident lately. I told her I'd been working on speaking up for myself in my personal life, and it was carrying over. She said it showed, and she wanted me to take on more leadership projects. Tom noticed too. One night while we were making dinner, he mentioned that I seemed lighter somehow. I thought about it while chopping vegetables and realized he was right. The constant stress of managing Diane's expectations had been weighing on me for years without me fully recognizing it. Now that I had clear boundaries and consequences, I didn't carry that tension around anymore. I slept better. I stopped checking my phone anxiously every time it buzzed. I could make plans without worrying about Diane's opinion. 6 months passed and life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Diane and I texted maybe twice a month, usually about neutral topics like upcoming holidays or family birthdays. We saw each other at monthly family dinners where she was polite but kept her distance. Dad called me every Sunday just to chat about normal stuff like sports or what he was reading. Tom and I started seriously discussing getting engaged and looking at apartments with better space. We adopted the cat I'd mentioned years ago, a tabby named Murphy, who Diane never commented on. Some of my cousins asked if things were still weird with Diane, and I told them we'd found a balance that worked. It wasn't the close relationship Diane probably wanted when she married my dad, but it was healthy and respectful, and didn't make me want to throw my phone in a lake. I'd learned that some people can't be in your life the way they want to be, and that's okay. Distance isn't failure when it protects your peace.